Survival games seem so now, with major titles like DayZ, The Long Dark, Don't Starve, and Ark Survival Evolved cropping up recently. It seems like an entirely new, modern genre. But it's actually an ancient survivor from the distant past of video games, an antediluvian relic dragged up from ancient time. To find the progenitor of the survival game, we need to head way back to 1971. Don Rawich, Bill Heineman, and Paul Dillenberger had to teach a class about the westward push of settlers in America and the perils they faced along the way. They created the Oregon Trail to do just that. In the 2 weeks it took to develop this text-based game, the developers established the survival genre as we know it today. Maintaining each individual character's health and equipment was essential if you were to fend off hostile animals and raiders, cross rivers in full flood, and stay healthy in the face of disease. When a party member died, it was permanent. When they're all dead, you have to start from scratch. That struggle to survive was the core of the genre. Unreal World started as a traditional roguelike way back in 1992. By the late 90s, it had shifted into something more akin to a modern survival game. Players were invited to adopt a traditional Finnish career, like fisherman or trapper, and take part in a close battle with the elements and wildlife. In a brave move for the time, temperature, weather, and starvation were introduced to the game. Trapping animals for their fur became more complex due to whole-world persistence for the new AI-controlled animals, easier to do in a 2D single-player game than in a modern 3D MMO, but still an impressive feat for the time. Today, after 25 years of continuous development, Unreal World is the longest continuously developed roguelike of all time. The Sims might not be a survival game in itself, though that depends on how often you do horrible things like trap your Sims in doorless rooms or set the kitchen on fire. But it's crucial to the survival genre, because its creation introduced a new idea to games. That crucial concept was supplied by psychologist Abraham Maslow, and it's called the hierarchy of needs. Basically, the hierarchy of needs is the idea that there are certain fundamental elements that people need for survival, which come before others. Physiological needs like shelter, water, food, and warmth come first, followed by safety, love, esteem, and finally, self-actualization. The Sims itself implements this as a core part of the game's mechanics. The player spends all their time working to cajole their Sims towards satisfying their basic needs, food, cleanliness, sleep, and so on, so that they can eventually go on to work or satisfy their deepest desires. For other games, Maslow's hierarchy gave an intuitive structure that designers could play around with, making players in games like DayZ focus on basic survival first and tooling up second, for example. Before he became famous for creating Minecraft, Marcus Notch Persson worked on several personal projects. One of these was the open-ended survival MMO Worm Online, which started development in 2003. Worm is a 3D voxel-based world allowing players to terraform the landscape by hand. You can also mine, build keeps and cities, and craft objects which degrade in real time. Worm introduced many of the core elements we expect in 3D survival games today. It's got a hostile world where players start with almost nothing, a minimalist set of tutorials, resource extraction and crafting, which can be a real grind, and a choice for players between cooperating or fighting with one another. Though there were survival MMOs before DayZ, they weren't hugely successful. DayZ started as a zombie mod for the war simulator Arma 2, but was quickly more popular than the original game, with 1 million players in its first 4 months. A standalone version was swiftly released. Surviving in the world of DayZ is hard. Each character has multiple points of weakness, from simple thirst, hunger and warmth, to more nuanced injury mechanics, where characters can suffer fractures to limbs, infections, disease, shock, and pass out from low blood pressure. This granular level of health data was also included in the earlier Sims-like Project Zomboid, and has become a staple of the genre. The biggest threat in the world of DayZ wasn't the eponymous zombies. Frankly, they were slow and weak. No, it was other players. With no restrictions on behaviour, players were free to exploit each other, and the game's limited resources encouraged this. This is a theme that's been continued in DayZ's successor games, Rust, H1Z1, and Nether. These games have increased the risk for the player, giving you limited incentives to both cooperate and fight, with a notable bias towards hostile competition. That makes for a more realistic and nuanced survival game, because humans are the most complex actors in any system, at least for the moment. We don't doubt that survival MMOs will continue to grow, but if they are to learn from historical games like Unreal World or Worm, they are going to have to overcome constraints. A lot of that comes down to what we want to call realism, objects that behave like they do in the real world. For example, to maintain cross-world systems on multiplayer servers requires AI entities, things like animals, plants, weather systems, gravity, to persist when players aren't there. That's computationally expensive. Or, to allow players to maintain a larger number of shared persistent buildings and cities, or let those cities be physically destructible like Minecraft, requires huge amounts of processing power. It's doable with tech like Improbable Spatial OS. For example, Worlds Adrift has spectacularly demonstrated that distributed physics can work by creating a huge 3D space with destructible foliage and flying ships. But it's still a design challenge. Creating truly compelling next-gen multiplayer survival settings, like scaled-up versions of Clay's 2D Don't Starve, will be both a technical and design challenge. Yet, with this inspirational history and the power of modern cloud computing, we're confident that we haven't seen the peak of the survival MMO just yet.